Hello and welcome. This is Phil Laidler from STL Partners. I am welcoming you to this private networking, Unlocking the Private Networking Opportunity webinar. And just to remind you all, you are just click in listen only mode. And this should find that you've got if you've got questions, if you're having difficulty with the sound, there's a control panel and you can raise those concerns. We can see if someone can help you. We're going to be taking questions. There's a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please, if you've got questions that arise from what you're seeing or just questions in general, please feel free to enter them at any time and we'll try to do our best to respond to those questions. If we're not able to answer the questions in the webinar during this hour, we will look through all the questions you submit and we'll get back to everyone. Get back to everyone with some responses to the questions. We'll also send the slides that you're going to see today, and we'll send a link with the recording of this webinar so that you can invite your colleagues to come look at it. Great. Well, just those of you who want to tweet, please use @STL Partners to tweet this and encourage everyone to come along. So I've noticed a number of attendees is still ramping up a bit, but what I'd like to do now is just start to move over and make some introductions. So there's myself, Phil Laidler, Director at STL Partners. I will not be presenting, but I will be helping to facilitate the session today. First up, it's going to be my colleague Yasmin. Yasmin is a senior consultant. She's also the coordinator for our telco cloud practice, and she's going to run through some of the key findings in some research we've recently completed with operators and enterprises globally around their private networking needs and outlook. Miran will also run through the key findings from this research. At the end of this presentation, what we want to do is going to invite Rodrigo, who is from Dell's service provider and telco transformation team. And also we're very happy to have Bob Pike from Intel Smart Edge. For those of you who aren't familiar with Intel Smart Edge, Intel Smart Edge is an edge native converged edge platform that's been built from the ground up in a new way to satisfy edge native converged networking. And it's had, I think, almost 100 deployments to date. So there's a lot of experience here, and therefore, if you've got questions, practical questions about the practicalities of private networking, Bob's a great person to put those questions to. And his background is in mobility and, of course, in on-premise networking, in enterprise and OT. And what he'll bring is that very hands-on, pragmatic view of the challenges and opportunities in delivering private converged networks. So that's the panelists. What I'd like to do now is to invite Yasmin to kick off and share our recent research in private networks. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Great, thanks, Phil. So there's been a lot of recent hype about private cellular networks with the wave and announcements of different companies trialing or deploying private LTE, private 5G, etc. And it's really touted to bring some of these enhanced capabilities and address key needs around security, reliability, coverage, performance, and be part of, future wireless technology makeup of on-premise connectivity. But what we're looking at is, what are private cellular networks? How do we define them? And where do they make sense? What are the entry opportunities for them? And how is it really that enterprises and the wider ecosystem can address this private cellular opportunity? So this is what we'll touch upon today. Just a bit of background, as Phil mentioned, our findings are based off of a recent interview program and survey that's been conducted by STL Partners with over 200 enterprises globally in industries such as manufacturing, energy and extractives, automotive, transport and logistics. So with that being said, to kick us off, I'll hand over to my colleague Miran.
Thanks, Yasmin. So yeah, as she said, there's been a huge surge of interest recently in this private cellular networking opportunity. And so what we wanted to understand is where enterprises are seeing the value in this opportunity. So what you can see here is a chart from our survey, and this is showing to what extent different enterprises feel private cellular networks can enable them to do certain things, whether that be reducing their connectivity costs or enhancing their existing applications. And the one benefit that stood out above the rest, which you can see here in red, is that ability to enable new applications. And almost 30% of our respondents rated this a 10 out of 10, which means they completely believe in the ability of private cellular networks to be able to do this. And this ties into what we heard a lot in our interviews about the need to find one anchor use case that is justifying the investment in the private cellular network. And that use case is often acting as the driving case behind the deployment. And so then once you've got that deployment, you can then leverage it for other applications and maximize the return on your investment. And so we also wanted to understand what enterprises are seeing as the #1 benefit of private networking compared to their existing solutions. And as you can see from this graph, security was the one that they voted for the most, followed very closely by reliability. And security is a factor that you would expect to be critical for certain industries like defense, where, you know, having unauthorized access to your data could be particularly dangerous. But actually from the survey, it became clear that this is something that's really important to enterprises across the board in all of the different industries, and it's something that they consider to be their #1 consideration when they're deciding what form of connectivity to use. And reliability is another key benefit of private cellular networks over those other forms of connectivity, particularly compared to Wi-Fi. So although adoption of Wi-Fi is very widespread, we did actually speak to a few different interviewees who expressed concerns that there can be issues with Wi-Fi, whether that be in industrial environments where if you have a lot of metal, it can cause interference, or in outdoor environments, particularly if there's, you know, wind or rain, that can hinder your connection. And so private cellular networks are seen as being more reliable, and they're seen as being able to enable that consistent connectivity that enterprises require for some of their applications. And although there are a lot of benefits that private networks can bring, there are still going to be a lot of challenges to adoption. And the first one that we came up across is that there is still this huge lack of clarity in what actually is a mobile private network, and what do enterprises and systems integrators consider to be, you know, under this umbrella term. And part of this confusion is from the fact that there's a real lack of understanding of private networking terminology and technology, but this is made a lot worse by the fact that there's a huge range of services being offered today that all come under this banner of private networks. And this can range from local to wide area networks using different combinations of, you know, spectrum or radio or core networking from private mobile operators, maybe from third parties. And a lot of what's being offered is being pitched as a private network, but it doesn't necessarily fit what we would define as being a standalone private cellular network. So for the purposes of clarifying going ahead, we define it using the following characteristics. So for us, a private cellular network is a standalone local on-premise network. So this is designed to cover a specific location or site, for example, a port, a mine. It could maybe be a campus site with, you know, a few factories, a few different warehouses. And that's not including those wide area networks that are addressing the need for national coverage, for example, with a rail network. We've also said it uses dedicated spectrum, whether that be licensed, unlicensed, or shared. So this could either be leased by a mobile network operator or a third party, or it could actually be owned by the enterprise themselves. And then finally, we define it as having dedicated operating assets. So that's the radio core and management infrastructure and software. And that can, you know, either include the enterprise's own assets. It could again be leased capabilities from an MNO or a third party, or it could be assets that are under a managed services contract from, again, an MNO or a third party. And so that is how we have been defining it and how we're defining it going forwards. And now that we've clarified that and made that clear, we're actually going to move on to a poll to see what you as the audience are viewing as the private cellular opportunity. So I think I'll hand over to Yasmin. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Miriam. So based on this definition, we'd like to hear your thoughts in a vote on which option best represents your view of private cellular networking for operational sites in your market. So here we've defined operational sites, basically anything but offices and educational venues. So this includes transportation venues, such as stations and airports, factories, warehouses, mines, oil rigs, retail venues, etc. So number one, do you see it as highly specialized and only catered to a small number of verticals, and will not account for more than 10% of total enterprise on-premise networking spend? Or do you see it as having much more of a smaller complementary role in on-site networking, with other solutions out there? Or is it a more dominant one with potentially up to 50% of total on-premise networking spend? Or on the far end, do you see most operational sites deploying private cellular across multiple verticals by 2025? Keen to get your thoughts on this. You should see a screen to vote. We're curious to hear your thoughts based on the industry you work in and also your view of your specific market. Great. We see some votes coming in now. Great to see. Just a few more seconds for some final answers. Great, so we should be able to share the results. Oh, great. So, wow, we seem to have a spread across the options. It seems like many of you, over a third of you, see private cellular networks as having a much more stronger and dominant place in on-site networking. And it's also interesting to see as well, the 20% of our audience members also saying that it's much more highly specialized and suited to a small number of verticals. So we'll explore a little bit later in terms of the nature of the private cellular networking opportunity. But in the meantime, Maren, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin. Oh, is that changing? There we go. So yeah, as we can see, there is a spread in private cellular networks. It seems people are seeing the value and where they can have a place, but they're not going to be the be-all and end-all. And one thing that became clear through our research is that the majority of enterprises still have multiple on-site networks and systems in operation. And of the people that we surveyed, the average number of different forms of connectivity that they use across their site operations was 3, but actually over a third of people that responded use 4 or more different types of connectivity. And we even think this could potentially be an underestimate of what the actual situation is like. And the reason that there are so many different systems being used is that often each additional connectivity solution is being linked to a specific application or use case. So you end up with having multiple dedicated networks. They could either be multiple public networks or multiple private networks. And often you're making a new dedicated network for each application or use case. And this is resulting in this huge amount of complexity and fragmentation, and it's becoming increasingly problematic to manage. And in theory, private networks can help to reduce this complexity because you have a single network that's able to support multiple use cases. And so it's an opportunity to address that fragmentation and be able to consolidate your systems. But in reality, despite all these promises, private networks, like I said, they're not going to be the be all and end all. They're not going to be that one type of connectivity that makes the alternatives obsolete. And the reality is that each form of connectivity, including Wi-Fi and industrial Ethernet, it does still have its place. And as you can see from the chart, Wi-Fi does still dominate as the most common form of connectivity that's being used across most of the industries we surveyed. And so what we anticipate is actually hybrid networking is going to become the norm. So private cellular networking will find its place amongst the traditional forms of connectivity like Wi-Fi and Ethernet, but its presence over time and over the next few years is going to grow as enterprises start to deploy those more advanced use cases and as their existing use cases become more mature. And so, we've said that we think that hybrid networking will become the norm. And so that becomes, or that leads us on to the next question of where private LTE and 5G networks are fitting into this. So when does it make sense to deploy them, and how can enterprises and operators identify when that opportunity is and be able to address that opportunity? So I'm now going to hand back to Yasmin, who's going to talk through the key factors that we feel need to be considered.
Great. So the nature of the private cellular opportunity depends on a host of different factors. And here we've identified 2 categories for these factors that affect the potential impact of a private cellular network. So on the left here, within the organizational factors, we look at the level of internal stakeholder alignment. So private cellular, as Mary mentioned, is an opportunity to really consolidate the number of interfaces you have and to address multiple use cases, with one network. But to do so really requires alignment across different teams, units, and application owners. And this is dependent upon the number of internal stakeholders involved, the maturity of technical or regulatory compliance required. So this really talks about the operational standards or requirements you're accountable for, whether that be around health and safety, IT security, product quality, etc. And we also point out the nature of decision making here. So do you have a more formalized or centralized structure or decentralized? How easy is it within your organization to make and execute a decision? And lastly, we look at the unity of purpose and control. So whether or not you have a shared vision within your organization across your stakeholders, and how does this also take into consideration third-party stakeholders such as contractors, suppliers, and subcontractors that may enable specific applications for you. Then we have the technical factors, which we refer to as the degree of cellularity. And here we need to consider the nature of your operational sites. So is it an indoor or outdoor one? Is it both? Are you in a remote or rural area? Are you offshore? Private LTE and 5G here is particularly suited to support some of that hybrid indoor-outdoor coverage, such as, for example, in industrial campuses, but also well suited for outdoor, remote, and offshore areas where even public cellular is limited. Then lastly, there's this need for mobility. And by this, we really mean the seamless handover between different cells and access points within your premises without any connection loss. So this is particularly important for those use cases with moving things like AGVs or location tracked assets. So based on these dimensions, how can we evaluate the private cellular opportunity? Here we put together our private networking opportunity matrix, as you call it, with 4 archetype situations below, each reflecting different opportunities, approaches, etc. So looking at quadrants 1 and 2 on the next slide, private cellular networking really thrives here when there is a high degree of cellularity, where there is need for outdoor or hybrid coverage, or the need for seamless mobility on site. Going back to the point Marion made earlier, some enterprises may have stringent security or reliability requirements, particularly for health and safety or data privacy, for example, for more mission critical applications, IP protection, etc. Majority of the live deployments that we see to date are actually in this quadrant, so in mining, ports, and oil and gas. But interestingly, while this quadrant used to be limited to specific areas, it is definitely growing in size as the degree of cellularity increases, for example, in manufacturing or aviation. As I mentioned before, for some companies, although there's a clear value for private cellular, they may be more constrained by internal challenges. So the ROI really depends on a number of use cases and applications that a private network can support and enable, but it's also about the ability to implement these applications. So if this is held up by and constrained by internal alignment challenges, such as securing budget or approvals, then this could constrain and even derail our deployment. Therefore, in this case, we recommend to focus on finding an anchor use case that can serve as a strong enough motivator for the overall investment. And this could be one where a private network can only enable, or it could be where a private network will have the biggest impact through one particular use case on key business metrics. But for others that have a lower degree of cellularity, it doesn't mean that private cellular networking is something that you shouldn't explore, but you should see private cellular as a potential innovation route and part of a bigger picture of connectivity. And you should see connectivity really as a key enabler of your digital transformation, of enabling new and more advanced use cases. And private cellular could be one key part of that equation. But again, this is about focusing on maximizing the value and capabilities of connectivity as a whole and addressing any potential fragmentation in systems. But again, this depends on your organization's ability to take advantage of these. While for some, private cellular is a must-have, it could be more of a nice to have for others. So if your existing connectivity solutions are already meeting your needs, you should start assessing your future needs and whether upgrades of existing solutions, for example, to Wi-Fi 6, is better suited than, for example, a private cellular network. But perhaps, this could change down the line if your requirements change as well. But the opportunity for private cellular ultimately depends on your needs and requirements. But what we've done is identified some key guiding principles for you to follow when evaluating your on-site connectivity. So number one, we talk about figuring out your strategic vision for your connectivity and the approach you want to take. Do you want to look at it in a more holistic view as a horizontal platform for your business to build on? Or do you see your vision as being more application-centric and a means of enabling a specific application on a case-by-case basis? Next, you should assess your connectivity needs based on this defined vision, including the use cases and applications within that defined scope. So the key thing here is about future-proofing, ensuring that you're building flexibility so you can aggregate existing needs and also plan for any future requirements. If you're deploying private cellular for one specific application for an anchor use case, then any future potential synergies can be pursued much more opportunistically. But third, after this, you should define the space that private cellular networking and also other solutions such as Wi-Fi and industrial Ethernet can fulfill, and use your strategic vision to really define a strong blueprint and roadmap for your connectivity and work with partners who fit this vision. Lastly, you should look to leverage any proof of concepts or live deployments to measure the benefits you're reaping and assess the key impacts on business metrics, and then seek to use this as a means of informing and educating other stakeholders within the organization. And I know that there is also, a host of different, people watching this, and for the telcos and other network providers who are watching this session, your role really should be on focusing and supporting your customers in this journey. So embrace your role and help them formulate this connectivity vision with as much clarity and precision as possible, which includes different milestones that you'd like to hit. Help them assess the current and future use cases that you need to be supported. And given that hybrid networking will continue, you should help your customers to identify which solutions work best given their needs. And private networking could be one of them. Then lastly, you should leverage these success stories and develop a sandbox or a test bed as a proof of value, not just a proof of concept, to help educate and inform other stakeholders within existing customers, but also future prospective customers as well. But in summary, the opportunity for private cellular networking is significant, but often not clear-cut. But I hope these guiding principles will help you in your journey when evaluating whether a private LTE or private 5G network is right for you. Thank you. Now I will hand it back to Phil. Phil, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute, thanks for that. So we gave you a little bit of information regarding the research. I just want to say that was almost the tip of the iceberg. We did an extensive survey. I think we had a question, actually, someone just asked us, it was the sample size, that was John. So the sample size was, I think, 200 companies were surveyed, I think in 8 countries, certainly in 3 or 4 continents. So that gives you a little bit of information about, and there's actually quite a lot of data there. We are producing a more detailed research report, which is actually going to be published very shortly. And everyone who's on this call and who attended this, we will forward the link to that to you when we publish it in the next week or so. And that will have a lot more charts and analysis. We really didn't have time to go through them all today, but a lot more analysis and findings looking at what our respondents were doing, what sort of applications they were supporting, how they're thinking about their private networking. So that will come down and we'll make that available to you. Yeah, so I just want to, before I sort of kick off and start to answer some of these questions that are coming in, just to remind you to submit your questions here on the control panel on the right. I can see there's some more of them coming in. Great, thank you. And I just want to kick off. There's one question here I can see, which is more of a definitional question. I think Carrie came back and sort of, I guess, questioned our use of standalone as a definition. I think what Carrie's saying is that a lot of private cellular networks and the ones that his company supports have roaming capability, and we would definitely include roaming capability, but the private cellular network itself is a standalone network which has links and it has roaming capability beyond the geography, and that is a key value. And that was one of the things we researched as well, asking people how important is it to be able to support those kind of roaming, in other words, supports the connectivity beyond the geography of the private network. And I would say that falls within that. Getting some more questions coming in here. So I'm just going to kick off before I go to some of these questions, and thank you, do keep submitting your questions. Before I do that, I just want to ask our panelists here, I want to ask Bob and Rodrigo what they thought about the poll, and also how would you have voted, Bob, on the poll in terms of the outlook for private networking?
Yeah, I actually would have probably voted in the same area, the 3 category, but I kind of want to add a little, I guess, caveat to it. I think the comment about the hybrid network is really relevant, because what we're seeing is multi-access, or this hybrid environment, is critical. So I think as we look at the future of this, that's what we're going to see. It won't be kind of this isolated, just 5G or 4G network. It will be a hybrid network. And with this new technology we have the ability to kind of manage it together. And I think that will change the dynamics a bit. And that's what we're finding in the brownfield circumstances. So that's kind of my 2 cents on the survey.
Thanks, and thank you for that, Bob. And Rodrigo, where would you have put your vote?
I think I would have voted with the majority. So option 3, I think they are very complementary, and there are clear use cases where a private cellular network would be the most suitable to the enterprise. But there are a lot of use cases where Wi-Fi will be more than enough, right? More than good enough.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. So I'm going to start processing some of these questions that are coming in. The first one I've got here is, the 2 of the findings we heard about from the team was that the lack of understanding and terminology was a barrier, and the other key barrier was around internal alignment, organizational alignment. I have two questions. There's a question here. The questioner has asked us, what was the biggest challenge? That's Victor has asked us, and I'll put that question to both Bob and Rodrigo, but I'll also put it to Yasmin and Miran. So, what have you found in practice are the biggest challenges to adoption? So, Bob, start with you first.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think the initial field tests and POCs, we'll be able to kind of get those going. But as we begin to want to advance that and think about operationalizing it, it's clear there are, let's say because it's kind of a network with OT involved and all these other things, we did run into issues about who's going to run it, who's going to support it. It was interesting when we would pull security in. There was this diversity of, well, I'm used to my firewall, I'm used to this. So, we clearly didn't do a good enough job in the early stages of messaging this holistically, because everything collapsed together. You need to kind of think about it so that you help your client with the fact that they may need managing these things in stovepipes. They may have different support teams. And you have to think through, how do you help them with that and work through it? So, there was a lot of organizational things, especially as we move past the POC to any kind of, let's put it out in a commercial environment.
Right. Okay. No, that's interesting. And briefly, Rodrigo, what are your views on the biggest barriers, and do they sort of reflect our findings of the research, or have you got other barriers that you think are the key ones to overcome?
Well, I think that as any new technology, there are a number of barriers that I think barriers to adoption, right? I think I would say that the perceived cost of this technology, lack of perception of the needs from the enterprise, and maybe other barriers as well, such as the lack of expertise, especially for smaller businesses. They might not have personnel, IT or telecoms people that would be able to help them. But I think overall, I would summarize as the lack of understanding of the business case, right? So basically, two areas. So what are the business benefits that technology will bring, and cost. So on the business benefit, I just to illustrate, I was talking to a telco recently, and I asked them what do you see as the key use cases, and what are your enterprise customers demanding? And the answer I got kind of surprised me in a way. They said, well, we don't see a lot of enterprises expressing an exact need. What they come and tell us is that their vendors are saying that they need private 4G or private 5G. So basically, and I can assure you that is not one of those vendors. So basically, I think it's important that we help, to determine or to quantify the value, right, the business value of this technology to overcome the first challenge, which is the benefit, right? And so Dell and Intel, and we are working in partnership with the service providers, with telcos and system integrators to exactly try to do that and come to the enterprises with a value assessment, right, based on the use cases. And the second element of the business case, the cost, right? So what we have seen from our customers is that they would prefer a monthly kind of payment, right? A flat fee, because a CapEx investment would be quite significant depending on the size of the deployment. So if we can help the enterprise customers, with an OpEx-based pricing, for instance, and we can help. We have, I don't know if you have seen Dell Technologies World recently, we have announced a project Apex, which aims to provide, more simplicity on demand as a service, cloud-based services to enterprises. So we are, this is at the heart of our strategy, simplify things for the enterprises. So that's how we plan to address the cost issue. So on the benefit side, working with our partners to help them understand the value, and on the cost side, create compelling offers, OpEx-based, consumption-based as a service in line with our Apex strategy.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question here, which I've got an interesting one, which I wanted to fire back, which is whether there was a difference, Bob, in your experience in the viability or the economics of private cellular networks with brownfield versus greenfield sites and environments.
Yeah, I mean, there's a clear difference. I mean, most of the deployments we have, once you get past the lab, they're brownfield in nature. And I'm going to leverage off something Rodrigo said, simplicity. I think early on when we were doing this a couple of years ago, I mean, we were so kind of used to the carrier kind of way it got consumed, that's the way we were presenting it. And that really isn't the way an enterprise works. So one of the things we're doing a lot with Dell right now is this simplicity piece. And that it directly addresses the brownfield circumstance. How do they manage policy? How do they manage onboarding users? How do they manage support? We moved from using our traditional terminology that we would use with the carrier to the terminology and the systems the enterprise has. And this is where the relationship with Dell has been fabulous, because we're working now to scale this. You've got to simplify its consumption. And that directly relates to the brownfield circumstance, not only the technology that's on site, which may kind kind of address this multi-axis or hybrid networking that the team was talking about. But then also just feeding the existing support systems and how things run. And the more we can do that, then the better this, let's say, gets installed in a cost-effective way, in a way that Rodrigo's point simplifies it. That's the biggest thing we're doing right now, is how do we simplify this such that it can be consumed economically?
Okay, no, thank you for that. I gotta move on a little bit. Another question for you here, Rodrigo, which is beyond the most obvious sites such as ports or open mines, what examples can you give us of not so obvious deployments of private networks, and why did private cellular make sense for them?
There are very interesting examples we have heard from our customers. I think probably the most interesting is in the let's say hospitality gaming sector. We have heard from one of our customers who is a gaming gaming machines maker, and they told us that one of their customers, casino, very famous casino, was interested in CBRS or private cellular in general, because one of the key barriers or one of the key constraints that a casino has is the placement of the machines, which is partly dictated by the availability of an Ethernet socket, right? And by removing that constraint, they could provide at least three benefits to the casino. The first is the flexibility of placing the machines wherever it makes sense, right? They can. I'm sure that there's a lot of research from behavioral psychologists and into the best, the most optimal place to put a machine. But anyway, they can be free to place the machines wherever it's better. And the second one is they can increase the number of machines, right? So they can better use the current layout of the building. And finally, they can create new services or maybe new new ways of improving the customer experience, such as providing a ruggedized or sort of waterproof tablet, for their guests to play games by the swimming pool, for example, right? That's one of the things that they were investigating as well. So basically, these are things that they might be able to do that with Wi-Fi, right? But I think private 4G or 5G would give them better quality of service, more security. And so I think that's the interesting use case that that casino was interested in.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. I've got a quick question for you, Bob, which is from someone, Ala, who's asking if you know specific examples of the benefits that oil and gas industries can get from private cellular deployments. Do you have any specific experience in those deployments?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I know this will sound simple, it's the first real value of the mobile worker, the engineer that's moving around, the maintenance person, and getting them secure access to the sensor network, the SCADA network. I mean, I can tell you the first use case is just mobile workers connected to things and getting data. I mean, I was amazed. People were running around looking at gauges, looking at data, and they gained so much efficiency by just sharing that with folks in a way that they know is secure, that they can act on immediately. Now, because we have this converged environment at the edge, maybe they can begin to do some even parsing of that data and provide, let's say, actionable information to the engineer. So, I mean, the first use case was really just sensor connectivity as well. And, because a lot of this technology is older and they need sensor overlays. And, these are very broad environments. So imagine being able to, with LTE, you can just do an MZ range and create your overlay sensor network. Now, I know these don't sound fancy, but these are a lot of endpoints. It solves a real problem and it helps them run the plant better.
Right. No, thanks for that. A very clear example. Yeah.
I have a few other examples. I think in terms of automation, improved automation and control, right? Because a private 4G or 5G can help, by replacing wired systems, to connect to, connect more easily to different sorts of controllers, switches, actuators. So it will allow them to improve the production line or redesign the production line. That will lead to operational efficiencies, improved reliability, improved resiliency. There are many other interesting use cases around video surveillance and analytics, remote monitoring, the connected worker, as Bob mentioned, and maybe some emerging technologies as well, like drones or robots, that could be used to inspect pipes. So yeah, basically it will allow not only increase efficiency, but new revenue streams, new business models, and better worker safety, right, and efficiency. So it's a very interesting sector for private cellular networks.
Okay, I've got a bunch of questions here for everyone around this this hybrid. There are questions here about when we say hybrid, what do we mean by hybrid? What is the hybrid mix? And the other is how do we see this playing out? Everyone said it's more complementary, but how do we see that complementarity sort of playing out? So maybe I'll just start with Yasmin first about that definition of hybrid networking, and also how we see that playing out.
Yeah, so when we mean a hybrid, because I can see some of the questions coming in, people are asking, is it public, private? Is it mobile, fixed? This is really looking at hybrid in terms of, are you using, wireless and wired connectivity, whether that be, for example, a private LTE, private 5G? Is this Wi-Fi? Is some of it going to be leveraging industrial Ethernet or other, LP-WAN technologies, etc.? And that's what we mean by hybrid. What we really see what we see happening within the hybrid networking world is more convergence. So in particular, we spoke to a manufacturing company where they were doing studies to look at, how they can consolidate some of these systems. And what they really found was, for their particular scenario, they found that a lot of their use cases could be served by 5G for some use cases, particularly anything that moves, and then also industrial Ethernet for fixed things. And going back to the point that Rodrigo made earlier, it's about that flexibility where, with private cellular, it's having that flexibility of being able to redesign the layout of your operating site and ensuring that if that is an important factor for your operations, to build that in as well with the different solutions that you're adopting.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that one with another question for Bob, which is quite a specific one, but it kind of coming back to this theme of alternatives and when is which better. This is a question from Raj, who's asking, while Wi-Fi is unlicensed and free to use with its own security features, why would anyone switch to a cellular-based solution?
Yeah, they would only do it if it's economically smart to do. And if you especially look at the indoor-outdoor scenarios, it is economically really solid. So you're not going to win any of these if the business case doesn't work. And I can tell you LTE is superb in a mobile setting, and it seems to, in our results, be very much more kind of reliable for the connectivity. And what I mean by that is it tends to deliver the same kind of experience each time. It's not highly variable. And there's a lot of deterministic kind of environments that require that. But I will say it's not an either or thing. I mean, Wi-Fi is very well suited for wireless support, right? It fits the bill, I think, as we look at Wi-Fi 6. We don't see it as an either or thing. We definitely see both technologies run together. I would encourage anyone to look at both the stacks, right? One manages state, the other doesn't. I would look at all the native security in them. They're both good protocols and they have their value in both places, but some just naturally, LTE naturally fits very well in, and it doesn't have to finagle it. And it is a standard. 3GPP is a standard, so you get interoperability. There's a lot of benefits. Now, I can tell you, we recommend Wi-Fi in the circumstance where it just makes more sense, right? So this is not an either or debate. I would say, if you think about 3GPP, they introduced the idea of multi-access. And think about this all working together kind of synergistically, even industrial Ethernet kind of things, terminating it into the multi-access. You can terminate wired circuits. That gives you a bridge to then when you get an air interface that could support that kind of deterministic network. So again, what I would suggest is the more you go see how this all works and what the problem statements are in the field, then it's an easier decision. You just let the use case and what's the better financial decision drive you.
Okay. I'm just going to follow. I've got a question here. Oops, I've lost it, from Raj. Where is it? Here we go. What is the cost barrier? And I want to put this to you, Rodrigo. What is the cost barrier to switch over, and who owns the capex for installing, say, a 5G private network? And for example, in a manufacturing factory. So yeah, the question here from Raj is really, what are the barriers and who typically will own capex, if it is capex?
Well, the cost, the cost barrier is difficult to mention, but I think it will depend on the size that we need to cover, right? I think we can help you identify with a broad order of magnitude how much it would cost you. So I would be happy to have a discussion with you, Raj, or anyone else in this webinar. By the way, please feel free to contact me, and we can have a specific discussion where we can discuss your specific needs, and quickly, after understanding the use case, the scenario, we can probably give you a quick estimation. We have, as part of the solution we developed with Intel and with radio vendors and with system integrators and with the telcos, we have what we call Dell T-shirt sizes. So basically budgetary costs for different configurations. And I'm happy to share that with you offline. The research that STL has carried out, actually, when you get the full paper, you will see that in some scenarios, right, it might be more cost effective to do that with a private cellular than with Wi-Fi. So I think it's probably, it's widely, I think, perceived that Wi-Fi is less expensive, but in some scenarios that is not true. So I would say it's not necessarily more expensive to have a private cellular network than a network with Wi-Fi. So that's the first point to address your question. The second point is who owns the capex, and again, it depends. Some big companies that have a lot of expertise, they might want to do it themselves, right? So they have the expertise, in their IT or telecoms teams. They might want to own the network, and they might do everything themselves. In some countries, they can own the spectrum as well. But what we have seen actually is that most enterprises, they don't want to own that. They don't want to have a capex type of transaction. They prefer to work with the carrier, with their telco, right? Who is going to provide an as a service service. So basically, they won't need to worry about capex. They will just pay on a monthly basis, and then again, we can also help you quantify that. So we have done a lot of financing, for different customers. We can easily convert what would be a CapEx type of deployment into an OpEx type of deployment. So again, the answer is it doesn't need to be a CapEx, and whether it's the enterprise doing it themselves or with the help of a system integrator or a carrier, it varies dramatically with a slight preference for the telco being involved.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Thanks for that. There's a couple of questions here from Jean-Christophe. Jean-Christophe's first question, I'm not going to answer it, Jean-Christophe, but I'm just going to raise it. It's not just yourself. There's a few people who've asked about the role of hyperscalers within private networking. And it's not a question I think we can answer, but I'm just going to say we are going to write a paper on this and publish on this. So do follow our publication, because that's certainly in the plan for us to publish on that. Your second question, Jean-Christophe, is around the size of the company. You've said it seems like most deployments today are very large enterprises, particularly large facilities. And Bob, do you think in the medium term, private networking solutions will be accessible to smaller size customers and generate potentially larger volume of opportunity?
Yeah, right now most of the let's say deployments activities is, I think they're correct. They're larger. When you look at any kind of everyone's heard the long tail of technology. We're definitely going to get there. I would say here's why I know we're beginning to see some financials that where it works, because we're lucky in a sense in this private networking. We're building it based on microservices, containerized environments where we can combine it in a way that you can shrink down a deployment into a very small number of cores and support with all the same features, and then you can grow it to where it's supporting hundreds of thousands of users. So the more we advance this and get better at setting the top to bottom policy of, because you're going to have everything working together on that edge node, right, in order for it to be economical. Technically, it's absolutely possible. And we're beginning to see, it's exciting, because think about it, you could have everything from SD-WAN up to the access method, even some applications running there. It's technically possible. Now, there's a lot of challenges operationally, things you got to make sure it can be, when the red light goes on, it can get fixed, but it's going to happen just like what happened in the cloud. And I will tell you, that will drive the economics of this to where it will address the long tail. And I think there's some solid opportunities for that to occur. But again, right now, I think you have in the whole crossing the chasm middles, we got the early adopters, the bigger sites, then we'll move toward, implementations in smaller sites.
And how far is it to those kind of volumes where we are potentially talking tens or hundreds of thousands of sites, say in a country like the US?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it if I knew, I don't want to guess. But I will say this: think about a flywheel, and the inhibitors to this isn't necessarily the technology, it's the work you all captured in education, building the ecosystem. And sometimes what we do as technologists, we work on the thing and not the ecosystem, right? And I think this is where Dell is just a great leader in it. They understand the importance of building out the ecosystem. So there's a lot of work behind this to build out the ecosystem, because it requires the SIs, it requires the ISVs to understand this. I think as we get that mature, if you look back into other kind of transitional technologies, sometimes the technology would be there, but we weren't there from an understanding of it, or the client's existing vendors to be able to help them implement it. So.
Okay, thank you for that. I am conscious of time. We have time for a couple more questions, but thanks, Bob, and really considered answer on that. There's a question here from Alexandra, who's asking, the question here is, who do we think is best suited to provide private LTE or 5G connectivity solutions? Is it telcos, systems integrators, other players? I'm actually going to fire that over to Miran, because this is a question we've certainly explored in the research. So Alexandra, when you get the detailed research, you see that we spend some time asking the enterprises who they saw as good or likely providers. So, but I'll let Miriam sort of take that on briefly.
Yeah, so as Phil said, this is one of the questions that we asked in the survey, and we asked, I guess with private networking solutions, sometimes it can be a bit of an ecosystem of players that are having to contribute to that solution, but definitely the telcos were seen as the preferred lead partner for offering a private cellular networking solution. By far and away, the majority of people voted for this. I think IT vendors and the SIs and solution vendors, also some people considered, but definitely there's a big role for the telecoms operator in offering these, and definitely the enterprises are most keen to be working with the telcos to be able to have this type of solution, I guess, because there's this perception that the telecoms operators are the ones who have that experience in connectivity and are able to offer that service and provide that more tailored solution to be able to offer that private network to the enterprise and do it in a slightly different way to how they would usually do it. You know, it's not a typical connectivity solution. It does have to be a slightly more tailored consultative sell. And so that's something that telcos will have to develop, that capability, and able to offer these more successfully. But there is a lot of potential for the telecoms operators to have a big standing in this space.
That's great. You've actually answered another question at the same time about the skills he's developed. So well done, Marie.
The one thing I would add to that as well, and we've heard this from even some of the large, they're extremely large companies that we've spoken to within the interview program, is that for the telecoms operators and as a key partner, it's really about trying to help them address sort of this complexity. And you know, they internally, even as one of the largest organizations in logistics, don't have the skills to be able to manage that themselves. And so what their telco partner provides is the ability to execute and help them define that connectivity strategy across their operations. And you know, this is around not just about, for example, could be about private cellular, but it's also around other solutions as well, helping to manage, for example, Wi-Fi solutions, helping to you know, manage, for example, their SD-WAN solutions, etc. And so that really is centrally controlled by you know, their lead partner, who is a telco.
I think this is closely connected to a question that Hervé has asked, which is, you know, to what extent in our research did we find that companies, enterprises were expecting to run private networks themselves, or have operators or third parties operate them for them? Very briefly, Yasmin, but to what extent were the mix of our expectations? And I know it's in the research, so.
Yeah, so we did ask this. We asked about, you know, what they would look to do themselves versus outsource to a partner, looking at the systems integration, the operations, and the management and maintenance of a private cellular network. And the majority of those did actually look to you know, outsource that to a partner, and that ranged from particularly the smaller enterprises themselves all the way through to organizations who have, you know, 10,000 or you know, over 50,000 employees within their organization as well. So it is across the board something that they would look to outsource.
So I'm going to ask Raj, who's our most prolific question answer. So he's asked a lot of questions, but they're good ones, Raj. So I will ask another question from Raj. And I'm going to send this over to Bob. And he says it's his last question, so fair enough. Have you come across any use case where the customer wants to retrofit on top of existing Wi-Fi infrastructure a 4G or a 5G cellular network? So my guess is it depends on the access points, depends on the hardware. But have you come across that at all?
I mean, there's, I would say, don't think about it as let's say we have a use case for like in a factory, you're moving things around and you want mobile workers. We're definitely using, let's say, LTE along with Wi-Fi. So there's some pods over here that are using Wi-Fi, and then there's some pods way out on the floor using LTE. So there's no question that we're seeing that. That's the smart thing to do, to test, right? You want to see. And then the other thing is maybe that setting over there is better because you already have Wi-Fi deployed. That particular area doesn't move. this particular work group moves around a lot, right? Because they're moving it around. So it's the same use case, so to speak, but it's using both the technologies. And one thing I wanted to just say, what I'm impressed with Dell's doing, Dell is recognizing this survey, and they're coming along with their solutions and services to help the telco deliver this into the market, right? So when you think about who can help deliver this, Dell, and this is why Intel is excited about working with Dell. Dell is definitely gearing up to help bring scale and simplicity to this. So I did, forgive me for the plug, but you know.
Good, no, it's fine. I'd like to thank Dell, because the Dell sponsored, along with Intel, you both sponsored this webinar along with the research. So thank you as well for that. Thanks everyone for the presentation. Thanks for fielding the questions, the panelists. Thank you for the audience for all of your questions and for participating. As I say, we will be sending up our answers to all your questions. We'll be sending a link to this webinar. We'll be sending slides, and we'll also, when we publish it, send you a link to the research report. So thanks everyone. Have a good day. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Phil. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.